Sinister stories.
The Winters family had moved into their new house on the outskirts of Seattle just a month ago. It was an idyllic setting, a large two-story home surrounded by towering pines, offering both privacy and a sense of peace. Richard and Emily Winters were excited to provide their children, Jack and Lily, with a space to grow and explore. They never anticipated that their dream home would soon become the setting of their worst nightmares. The house was equipped with modern security features, including a state-of-the-art doorbell camera. Richard, a tech enthusiast, enjoyed checking the camera feed from his phone, especially at night, just to ensure everything was secure. It was a Friday evening when he first noticed something peculiar. As he sat on the couch watching a movie with Emily, Richard's phone buzzed with a notification. "Motion detected at front door," it read. He opened the app and saw a dark figure standing just beyond the porch light's reach. The figure wore a long, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. It stood motionless, facing the door. "Hey, Em, look at this," Richard said, showing his wife the live feed. Emily frowned and leaned closer. "Who is that?" she whispered, an edge of concern in her voice. "I don't know. Maybe a lost hiker?" Richard suggested, though the idea seemed unlikely. They watched the figure for a few minutes, but it didn't move. Feeling uneasy, Richard activated the intercom. "Can I help you?" he said, his voice echoing through the speaker. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned slowly and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. "That was creepy," Emily said, shivering slightly. "Probably just someone who got lost," Richard reassured her, though he didn't entirely believe it himself. The next morning, they checked the footage again, but there was no sign of the stranger. Life went on as usual until the following Friday, when the same notification appeared. This time, the figure was closer to the door, its features still hidden in the shadows. Richard felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the figure linger for a few minutes before vanishing once again. "Rich, this is getting weird," Emily said, her worry growing. "Maybe we should call the police." "I'll give it another night. If it happens again, I'll call them," Richard replied, though he was equally unsettled. That night, Richard barely slept. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, keeping him on edge. The doorbell camera remained silent, offering no new sightings of the mysterious visitor. The following Friday arrived, and Richard felt a sense of dread as evening fell. Sure enough, the notification came again. "Motion detected at front door." This time, the figure was right up against the door, its face almost pressed to the camera lens. Richard could make out more details now, a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes and an unsettling smile. Richard activated the intercom once more. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure's smile widened, and for the first time it spoke. "I just want to come in." Richard's heart raced. "No, go away or I'll call the police." The figure didn't respond, but stepped back into the shadows and vanished once more. Richard's hand shook as he turned to Emily. "We're calling the police." The local authorities arrived within an hour. They took Richard's statement and reviewed the footage, but the figure was gone before they could arrive. They promised to increase patrols in the area and advised the Winters to keep their doors and windows locked. Days passed without incident, and the family began to relax, hoping that their unwelcome visitor had moved on. But the peace was shattered the next Friday evening. The notification came through again, and this time, the figure was not alone. Two smaller figures stood beside it, both dressed similarly in dark, old-fashioned clothing. Emily gasped when she saw them. "Oh my God, Richard! Those are children!" Richard's blood ran cold as he watched the three figures standing silently at their doorstep. He activated the intercom, his voice trembling. "What do you want? Why are you doing this?" The adult figure spoke again. "We want to come in." "No," Richard shouted. "Leave us alone." The figures turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Richard and Emily decided it was time to take drastic measures. They installed additional security cameras around the property and set up an alarm system. They even considered moving but hoped that the increased security would deter their mysterious visitors. For a few weeks, there was no sign of the figures. Life began to return to normal, and the Winters family allowed themselves to hope that the ordeal was over. But on the fourth Friday, the notification came once more. Richard's heart pounded as he opened the app. The figures were back, this time standing in a line. The next day, Richard reached out to a local historian, hoping to find some answers. Dr. Alan Morse was a retired professor with a deep knowledge of the area's history. When Richard explained the situation, Dr. Morse agreed to come over and investigate. As Dr. Morse examined the footage, his expression grew more and more grave. "This is troubling," he said. "The clothing these figures are wearing is very old, likely from the late 19th or early 20th century." "Do you think they're ghosts?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Morse sighed. "It's possible. There are stories about this area, about a family that disappeared under mysterious circumstances over 100 years ago. Some say they were cursed, others say they were victims of a terrible crime." "Is there any way to stop them?" Richard asked desperately. Dr. Morse shook his head. "If they are indeed spirits, they may be tied to this place for reasons we can't understand. You could try a spiritual cleansing or blessing, but there's no guarantee it will work." That evening, the Winters family gathered in the living room, feeling a sense of impending doom. They had arranged for a local priest to come the next day to bless the house, but tonight they would have to endure whatever came. As darkness fell, the notification came again. Richard hesitated before opening the app, his hands shaking. The figures were back, standing in a semicircle around the front door. There were even more of them now, at least a dozen, their faces pale and eyes hollow. Emily sobbed quietly as Richard activated the intercom. "Please, just tell us what you want." The original figure stepped forward. "We want to come in," it said in that same chilling voice. "Why? What do you want from us?" Richard pleaded. The figure's smile widened, its hollow eyes boring into the camera. "We need you." Richard felt a wave of nausea. "No, you can't come in." The figures remained for a moment longer, then turned and vanished into the night once more. Richard and Emily held each other tightly, praying for dawn to come. The priest arrived the next morning and performed a blessing, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers throughout the house. The family felt a sense of relief, hoping that the ritual would protect them from their ghostly visitors. For several weeks, there were no sightings. The doorbell camera remained silent, and the Winters family began to believe that they were finally free of the haunting. But deep down, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. One Friday evening, nearly 2 months after the priest's visit, the notification came again. Richard's heart sank as he opened the app. The figures were back, more of them than ever, filling the front yard and extending into the trees. Their eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, and their faces were twisted into grotesque smiles. Richard felt a cold dread settle over him as he activated the intercom. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice breaking. The original figure stepped forward, its eyes gleaming. "It's time." "No!" Richard shouted, but the figure's smile only widened. Without warning, the camera feed cut out, plunging the screen into darkness. Richard's phone buzzed with a new notification. "Motion detected at back door." He and Emily rushed to the kitchen, where the back door was located. They peered out the window and saw the figures standing in the backyard, closer than ever before. The doorbell camera at the front door buzzed to life again, showing the figures advancing towards the house. "They're surrounding us," Emily whispered, her voice filled with terror. Richard grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling. "We need help. There are people outside our house and they're trying to get in." The operator assured him that police were on the way, but Richard felt a growing sense of hopelessness. He turned to Emily. "We need to barricade the doors." They scrambled to push furniture against the front and back doors, their panic mounting with each passing second. Jack and Lily, awakened by the commotion, appeared at the top of the stairs, their faces pale with fear. "What's happening, Dad?" Jack asked, his voice quivering. "It's going to be okay," Richard said, trying to sound reassuring despite the terror in his voice. "Go back to your rooms and lock the doors." Jack and Lily hesitated but did as they were told. Richard and Emily continued to fortify the doors, pushing heavy furniture against them and double-checking the locks on all the windows. The house grew eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant sound of footsteps outside. Richard's phone buzzed with another notification. Motion detected at side window. He switched to the side camera feed, his heart pounding. The figures were now circling the house, their hollow eyes peering into the windows. One by one, they pressed their faces against the glass, their smiles growing wider with each pass. Emily sobbed quietly, her hands shaking. "Richard, what do we do? We can't keep them out forever." Richard glanced at his phone, willing the police to arrive sooner. "We just have to hold on until help comes. They can't get in as long as we keep everything locked." But even as he spoke, a loud bang echoed from the front door, followed by another from the back. The figures were testing their defenses, pushing against the barricades with increasing force. Richard checked the cameras again, his heart sinking as he saw more figures emerging from the woods, joining the growing crowd surrounding the house. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Emily screamed, and Richard fumbled for his flashlight, switching it on to reveal the terrified faces of his family. The children's cries echoed through the house, heightening the sense of dread that permeated the air. "Stay together," Richard said, his voice trembling. "We need to stay together." They huddled in the living room, the only light coming from Richard's flashlight and the faint glow of his phone screen. The banging on the doors grew louder, more insistent, as if the figures were growing impatient. A crash came from upstairs, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Richard's blood ran cold as he realized they were no longer confined to the ground floor. He shone his flashlight towards the stairs, but the darkness seemed to swallow the beam. "Stay here," he told Emily. "I need to check on the kids." Emily clutched his arm. "Be careful!" Richard crept up the stairs, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. He moved towards Jack's room first, his heart pounding in his chest. "Jack, are you okay?" he whispered, knocking softly on the door. There was no response. Richard turned the handle and pushed the door open, shining his flashlight inside. Jack was sitting on his bed, clutching a baseball bat, his eyes wide with fear. "Dad, they're trying to get in," Jack whispered, pointing to the window. Richard followed his gaze and saw one of the figures pressed against the glass, its hollow eyes staring directly at them. He closed the curtains, blocking the sight, and moved to check on Lily. Her room was similarly untouched, but the sound of breaking glass was growing more frequent, echoing through the house. Richard returned downstairs, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here. The police should be here soon. We just have to make a run for it." Emily nodded, her face pale. "How? They're everywhere." Richard glanced at the back door. "We'll go through the kitchen. It's closest to the woods. If we can make it to the trees, we might lose them." They gathered the children, and Richard led the way to the kitchen, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The banging on the doors grew louder, more frenzied, as if the figures sensed their plan. Richard threw open the back door and ushered his family outside. The figures turned to face them, their eyes glowing in the moonlight. Richard took a deep breath and shouted, "Run!" They sprinted towards the trees, the figures closing in from all sides. Richard could hear the sound of footsteps behind them, growing louder with each passing second. He pushed Jack and Lily ahead, urging them to go faster. As they reached the edge of the woods, Richard glanced back and saw the figures standing at the tree line, watching them with those hollow eyes. They made no move to follow, but their presence was a constant threat. The family plunged into the forest, branches scratching at their skin as they ran. The sound of their own breathing filled their ears, mingling with the distant cries of the figures. They ran until their legs burned, finally collapsing in a small clearing, gasping for breath. Richard checked his phone, relieved to see a signal. He dialed 911. And this time, the operator confirmed that the police were on their way. They waited in the clearing, huddled together, every rustle of leaves sending a jolt of fear through them. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Flashing lights appeared through the trees, and Richard felt a wave of relief as the police officers emerged, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Over here," Richard called, waving his flashlight. The officers approached, their expressions wary. "Are you the Winters family?" one of them asked. Richard nodded. "Yes. Thank God you're here. There are people, things, trying to get into our house." The officers exchanged glances but didn't question him. They escorted the family back to the house where they found the doors and windows shattered, the furniture overturned. But of the figures, there was no sign. The lead officer, Detective Harris, took their statements and reviewed the camera footage. His face grew graver with each passing minute. "This is unusual," he admitted. "I've never seen anything like this." "Do you think they'll come back?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Detective Harris sighed. "I don't know. We'll have patrols in the area, and we'll keep an eye on things." "I suggest bringing in a paranormal expert," Harris said reluctantly. "I don't usually go for that sort of thing, but in this case, it might be worth a try." Desperate for answers, Richard contacted a renowned paranormal investigator named Dr. Evelyn Marks. She agreed to visit the house and conduct a thorough investigation. When Dr. Marks arrived, she brought a team of specialists and an array of equipment. They spent several days in the house, setting up cameras, sensors, and other devices designed to detect supernatural activity. On the third night, Dr. Marks gathered the Winters family in the living room. "We found some interesting things," she said. "There are definite signs of paranormal activity, but what's most concerning is the nature of these entities. They seem to be drawn to your family specifically." "Why us?" Emily asked, her voice filled with dread. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "What do we do?" "We'll perform a cleansing ritual," Dr. Marks said. "It might help to break their connection to you, but there's no guarantee it will work permanently." The ritual was elaborate, involving chants, incense, and the sprinkling of blessed water. The house seemed to grow darker as the ritual progressed, the air thick with an oppressive energy. As Dr. Marks completed the final incantation, a loud crash echoed through the house and the front door flew open. The figures stood in the doorway, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Stand back," Dr. Marks shouted, raising her hands in a defensive gesture. The figures hesitated, then slowly began to retreat, their eyes fixed on the Winters family. "We want to come in," the original figure said, its voice echoing through the room. "No," Dr. Marks shouted, her voice filled with authority. "You are not welcome here." The figures wavered, their forms flickering like shadows in the wind. For a moment, it seemed as if they might vanish entirely, but then the original figure stepped forward, its eyes burning with intensity. "We will come in," it said, its voice resonating with an eerie finality. With a sudden, blinding flash of light, the figures disappeared, leaving the house in an unnerving silence. Dr. Marks lowered her hands, her face pale and drawn. "It's done," she said. "It's done," she said, though her voice was tinged with uncertainty. The Winters family stood in stunned silence, the echoes of the chilling encounter lingering in the air. For the first time in weeks, the house felt still, as if it were holding its breath. That night, the Winters family huddled together in the master bedroom, reluctant to separate. They left the lights on, hoping the brightness would keep the shadows at bay. But just then, Richard's phone buzzed with a notification. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced at the screen. Motion detected at front door. He stood up, his body tensing. Emily noticed his reaction and immediately felt a surge of dread. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard hesitated, then opened the app. The screen displayed the front porch, but this time there was no dark figure. Instead, the door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. "I'll check it out," Richard said, his voice steely with determination. Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Be careful." Richard approached the front door cautiously, his heart pounding. As he reached for the handle, he felt a strange, cold sensation, as if the air around him had suddenly dropped in temperature. He pushed the door open wider and stepped outside. To his relief, there was nothing there. He closed the door and let out a loud sigh, but the relief was short-lived. As Richard got back into bed, he checked the doorbell camera again out of habit. He then froze. The screen showed a dark figure standing at the edge of the property, its hollow eyes fixed on the house. He blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light, but the figure remained, unmoving and relentless. Richard's heart sank as he realized the truth. The darkness had never truly left. "We want to come in," a voice whispered through the intercom, echoing in the stillness of the night. Richard's blood ran cold. The figures had returned. He woke up his wife, who sat up screaming as the shadowy figures were all now surrounding their bed.